Good evening, my friends, and welcome to the Loop of Horror. I'm Count Dracula. Tonight, we have prepared for you a top of very disturbing anecdotes. Stories told by people who work in funeral homes. So they have contact with death in their day-to-day lives. Dealing with bodies that have lost their freshness is not an easy task. Believe me, removing blood stains from the carpet is serious business. By the way, what is the number for the cleaning service, Igor?
You have always kept the business cards of the cleaning companies, master.
Bah, I need to find another company. Or maybe I shall stop eating the people they send.
Anyway, while the master goes to look for his dinner, you get uncomfortable and turn off the lights. Because this is our loop of anecdotes, creepy things that happens at funeral homes. Before we begin, we remind you that we upload new and monstrous videos every Tuesday night. If you like this type of content, subscribe and activate the bell so you can get caught in this loop of horror.
I've been working in funeral homes for over a decade, and I have to admit that this was never my first choice, let alone imagining that this would be my workplace. This is why I believe that fate has plans for all of us and eventually places us where we should be. It was thanks to a relative who recommended me to one of the most important funeral homes in the city that I got this job. At the beginning, I had many prejudices of working in such a place, being surrounded by death and bodies, in addition to constantly seeing the sadness and tears of families saying goodbye to their loved ones. It is not something that everyone can bear in their day-to-day. Although the idea that these places are always infested with spirits, demons, and other entities, it was that in which disturbed me the most. Over time, I realized that this place, this job, as like any other, although the feeling of sadness that surrounds is overwhelming, it is such a strong and contagious energy that can be dangerous if you let yourself be carried away by the feeling. There are many urban legends around these places, but what happened to me is something that to this day I cannot explain. And not only was I a witness, my colleagues were also part of this story. It all started when some of us noticed the presence of a woman who came to the wake. In particular, she was not such a strange thing. She was a very old woman who walked among the relatives in complete silence and stealth. It was as if her feet didn't even touch the ground. She went unnoticed and sat in the back of the room, alone, and she stayed there, watching the scene without saying anything, without talking to anyone. A black veil covered her face, and her clothing of the same color as hers barely showed her pale, wrinkled skin through her sleeves. The aura that surrounded her wasn't necessarily sinister, but it did reflect a complete emptiness around her. She would stand there watching, and after a couple of hours, she would leave the place the same way she arrived. We are not sure when she began visiting grieving relatives, as her image and demeanor did not stand out from the crowd. However, as time went by, we began to notice that she always came alone and she never spoke to anyone. In addition, that she constantly returned and went to wakes of families that were not related to the previous ones. For a while, this just seemed like a curious situation. An elderly woman who attends wakes for strange people, a strange pastime. But older people usually do weird things, right? However, we noticed something disturbing. There was a repeating pattern. At each wake this woman was present, a relative died within a few days. We saw it over and over again, as if that woman were an omen of death. Some believe that she is an angel, accompanying the deceased on her way, but others believe that she is the embodiment of death itself, ready to take someone else's soul. Although some have tried to talk to her, she never responds and just stands there, watching, choosing the next one on her list.
If I remember correctly, I was in high school when this happened. Unfortunately, a good friend of my father passed away. I hardly knew this person, but since my family owns a funeral home, they offer services to the family for free. Although for me, this was just one more funeral, I will never forget what happened to the relatives of that poor man. Everything started in a normal way. Many people attended the wake. Family and friends filled the place. But as the night progressed, the place began to be empty. People were leaving little by little, and at one point in the night, only the closest relatives remained. The few that remained continued to talk, but at dawn, strangely, everyone began to feel a very deep sleep, and without realizing it, one by one, they ended up falling asleep. When they woke up later, late in the morning, they did not believe what had happened. Before their eyes was the empty coffin. The body of that man disappeared. And they could not find it anywhere. No one had seen anything. Not the funeral home employees, not the guard, not even my father, who spent the whole night in the office. At the time, we did not have surveillance cameras, and to date, no one has been able to find an answer to the whereabouts of this man. My father got into a legal trouble. The family accused him of having stolen his body, something that made no sense since the deceased was a friend of my father. Also, how could someone move a body in front of so many people without anyone noticing? The family had no choice but to resign themselves and bury an empty coffin, which was very sad. What happened that night remains a mystery. Although, years later, talking with my father about the subject, he told me that before burying the coffin, he could see marks that seemed strange to him on the sides of the box. but he never wanted to tell me more about what he saw that infamous night. After investigating whether similar cases had already occurred, I came across the belief that by watching over a family member all night, you can prevent unwanted spirits from trying to inhabit the body of a recently deceased.
This happened when he was a child. He would be around 12 years old. At that time, both my father and my mother worked in the mornings very early, and because of this, they could not take me to school. We lived far away and the bus didn't pass my house. But luckily, my cousin and I studied together, so my uncle offered to drive me every morning. He also came to pick us up in the afternoons when we left. It was very common for him to invite us to eat something on the way back on Fridays. But we also usually accompanied him to do some errands for his work before I got home, where my parents would pick me up. That was our usual routine. But that day something changed. My uncle came for us, and you could see some concern on his face. He asked us to get into the car fast, and he sped up. On the way, he told us that he was late to make some deliveries and that we were not able to get anything to eat. He was driving very fast. I felt a little scared when we saw how we passed between the cars, and suddenly, I heard the sound of the tires braking hard. I closed my eyes, and the last thing I heard was a crash, and it felt like everything was in a slow motion until I no longer felt anything. Everything was dark. I tried to open my eyes, but it was not possible. In fact, I realized I couldn't move. I didn't feel anything. I was just there, surrounded by darkness. But I was aware. After a while, I began to hear screams, the sounds of sirens, and the cry of people around me. I heard the voice of the paramedics taking me to the hospital. Afterward, I would hear someone babbling and my mother's voice breaking into tears. Did I die? But how was this possible? I was still here, I just couldn't move. They couldn't hear me no matter how much I tried to scream. After that, I remember that they talked about my funeral. They placed me in a coffin. My father, mother, and relatives were crying around me and saying goodbye to me. I felt powerless. I couldn't do anything. I screamed and screamed. But no one realized that I was still conscious. When I finally calmed down among the people, I could see the silhouette of some people that I did not recognize. They seemed to have their own light, and everything became very bright. The light was so blinding that everything went white, and that's when I woke up. It had all been a dream. I was agitated and had tears in my eyes, but I was relieved that nothing was real. I couldn't sleep. I was scared to go back to that place, so I stayed there, lying on the bed until dawn. It was finally time to go to school. Throughout the day, I had a feeling of unease. I knew that what had happened was just a dream, but I could not forget it since it felt so real and that my hands were shaking and my mouth was dry. At the end of my classes, my teacher came to me. She seemed distraught. She was trying to tell me something, but she didn't dare. She just kept saying that everything would be fine. When my cousin arrived, the teacher's voice began to break, and with tears in her eyes, she told us that my uncle had unfortunately had an accident. Apparently, he had stopped to do some errands before picking us up, and on the way, he collided with another car. He died instantly. During the wake, I kept thinking about my uncle's accident and my dream, how strange everything had been. I felt guilty, although the accident was not caused by me. I went to where my uncle's body was to tell him not to worry, that if he was in a dark place, he would soon find a light. I told him that everything would be fine.
This story was always told by my grandmother. She said it had happened to her when she was young. In the town where she lived, there was a lady who had a reputation not for being a witch, but for doing things related to witchcraft and the occult. No one knew exactly what she was doing, but among the locals it was said that she had made a pact with the devil. The fact is that when the woman passed away, my grandmother, who worked for the town funeral home, was in charge of preparing the body. My grandmother says that as night fell, something sinister and unexplained happened. As she prepared all her equipment for work, a very strong smell filled the room, a smell of death. But this was not possible. This person had not been dead for long. So it wasn't possible that her decomposition was so advanced as to smell like that. It will be about 15 minutes after noticing this nauseating smell when she, before her eyes, could see how the skin of the body began to shed very quickly. It was as if the rotting of the corpse was accelerated. Seeing such a scene, my grandmother jumped back and screamed. When they heard the other workers, they ran to see what was happening. When they entered the room, they were astonished. They did not know how to react, but little by little, before such an event, they were terrified. For they witnessed how that woman's eyes came out of her sockets and her tongue was detached from her mouth. In an instant, the body was without skin, and the blood, together with a viscous, yellowish, and smelly liquid, began to drain to the floor. At this point, they all ran out, but when they finally decided to go inside once more, they only found a black skeleton on the table, that it seemed to have been burned. My grandmother comments that when the relatives were called to inform them what had happened, none seemed surprised by these statements. This is why people believe that what happened was proof that this woman really had a connection with the dark arts.
Like this video to prevent the night beast from bothering and visiting you. And subscribe, activate the bell for creepier and twisted content brought from the bowels of the beyond. Remember that you can find unique content, information about our next videos, bases for our bizarre contest, and much more on our social media, found in the description. Do not hesitate and let yourself be caught by our loop of horror.
Last but not least, we ask that you be respectful in a funeral home. The deceased can no longer do anything to you, but you never know what kind of vermin roamed the place.